My name is Madison Clark, and the night my husband told me he was leaving for another woman, my entire world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just any woman, it was my stepsister, and she claimed to be pregnant with his child. You know that moment in movies where the sound drops out and everything moves in slow motion? That was me sitting in our glass-walled penthouse in downtown Chicago, staring at the man I thought I knew. The irony: people think being married to the son of a real estate tycoon means you've got everything: money, security, a charmed life. But I'd built my world on my own grit, not his last name. I'd clawed my way from waitressing double shifts in a greasy diner to running multi-million-dollar deals for Whitman Properties. And now the man I'd stood beside for 6 years was telling me he wanted a divorce, because my stepsister, someone who had never worked a day without scheming an angle, had supposedly given him the family I couldn't. I remember gripping the edge of the marble counter, forcing my voice to stay calm. Inside, it felt like a steel rod was holding me upright because I refused to give him the satisfaction of watching me crumble. "When is she coming to tell me herself?" I asked. His eyes darted away. She'll stop by next week when you're off work." Off work. As if I could just step away from the empire I'd been helping build while he wandered through life without a care. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the city lights spilling through the curtains like silent witnesses. My mind kept looping back to the same thought. If this was war, and it was, I wasn't going to lose my command. Because here's the thing in my business: when someone makes a move, you don't flinch. You watch, you wait, and then you strike back with precision. The betrayal burned, but beneath the sting was a sharper instinct: self-preservation. I wasn't about to be the discarded wife who slinked away quietly while someone else waltzed into the life I had worked to hold together. I knew how the corporate world worked, how whispers in boardrooms could turn into votes, and how quickly influence could vanish if you weren't careful. If I lost him, fine, but I would not lose my place at Whitman Properties. It's funny, pain sharpens you. It strips away the noise and leaves you with the clearest version of yourself. And as I lay there, I realized something: this wasn't just about love or betrayal anymore. This was about control. My life, my work, my future. I've learned that people will try to write your ending for you, especially when they think you're too shaken to hold the pen. But I wasn't going to hand mine over. And if you're still with me right now, you probably know exactly what I mean. Before I tell you how I turned the tables, I want to know: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and if you want the full unfiltered truth, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Because trust me, this is just the first move in a game my stepsister thought she could win, and she had no idea who she was playing against. Chicago's skyline has a way of looking untouchable: steel and glass reaching into the clouds like nothing could break it. But I knew better. I knew that behind those shining windows, entire empires could crumble overnight. My own life felt exactly like that, glittering on the outside, but with hairline fractures spidering through the foundation. After Jason dropped his little bombshell, the days that followed were a strange blend of routine and raw disbelief. I still woke up at 5:30, hit the gym, downed my protein shake, and stepped into my power suit. I still rode the elevator up 42 floors to the Whitman Properties executive suite. But inside, I was playing a second, much more dangerous game. At work, no one could suspect a thing. In real estate, weakness is like blood in the water: it draws out predators. Our board members were savvy sharks, the kind who could sense hesitation in a handshake. And if they even sniffed that my marriage to the founder's son was falling apart, they might start whispering about whether I still belonged in my position. That's what people didn't get. My title wasn't a trophy Jason had handed me, it was earned. I'd brokered deals that pulled the company out of slumps, navigated property disputes that could have cost millions, and steered developments through messy zoning nightmares. But perception is a fragile currency, and I couldn't afford for mine to drop a single point. So I smiled in meetings, pitched confidently to clients, and pretended my nights weren't spent staring at the ceiling in our penthouse rehearsing every possible move. I couldn't shake the image of my stepsister Veronica strutting in with her designer bag and smug little smirk, thinking she'd already won. She didn't know Jason's charm masked a chronic disinterest in the very empire she was chasing. She didn't know the Whitman family didn't just hand over power, they watched, tested, and measured. And here's the kicker: Jason wasn't even close to the helm. He had an advisory title, sure, but the only real decisions he made were which golf club to join, or which watch to wear to a gala. I'd been the one closing deals, directing expansions, and balancing budgets. If Veronica thought she'd just walk into a mansion and a bank account, she was about to learn that sometimes the crown isn't where you think it is. Still, I had to think bigger. Divorce wasn't just emotional, it was political. In our world, splitting from a Whitman meant lawyers' contracts, and most importantly, leverage. I needed my father-in-law on my side before Veronica even set foot in my home. That Thursday, I drove out to the Whitman estate in Lake Forest. The drive alone felt like slipping into another universe, tree-lined roads, wrought iron gates, sprawling lawns that whispered old money. My father-in-law, Charles Whitman, greeted me in his study surrounded by shelves of leather-bound ledgers and framed architectural blueprints. I told him everything. Not in a tearful, pleading way, but in the clear, controlled tone I used in boardrooms. Jason's affair, Veronica's supposed pregnancy, the request for divorce, my need to protect my position. Charles didn't react right away. He just leaned back, fingers, steepled eyes sharp under those silver brows. Finally, he said, "You are the best thing to happen to this company since I broke ground on my first tower. Jason, he's my son, but he's never had the fire. You do. And I don't care if you carry the Whitman name or not, you keep running things. I'll deal with him." Relief hit me like oxygen, but it came with a twist of sadness. This man valued the company over his own son. Then again, so did I. Driving back to the city, I replayed his words the way he'd dismissed Jason's role without hesitation. It was both validation and ammunition. Veronica could think she was marrying into the throne, but the king had already chosen his successor, and it wasn't Jason. That night, Jason barely looked up from the TV when I walked in. I watched him for a long moment, wondering how someone could throw away not just a marriage, but his own seat at the table. But maybe that's the difference between us. I build. He drifts. And now I had the silent backing of the man who actually pulled the strings. The board would follow his lead. My job, my projects, my influence, they were safe. If you've ever had to smile through a storm because you couldn't let anyone see you sink, you know exactly what this feels like. That's why I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to keep your personal life locked away just to protect your professional standing? Share it. Because sometimes those of us who look like we're on top are fighting battles no one sees. And the only way to win is to play them smarter than anyone expects. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Veronica thought she was walking into a coronation. What she was really walking into was a chess match, and I'd just secured my queen. I didn't grow up anywhere near the manicured estates and penthouse suites I move through now. My earliest memories aren't of summer homes or country club brunches. They're of the clatter of dishes in the back of a roadside diner, the scent of burnt coffee, and my mother's tired hands counting out crumpled bills at the kitchen table. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Joliet. The walls were thin, the winters brutal, and every creak in the floorboards reminded me we didn't own a single square foot of the place we called home. My mom worked 2 jobs day shift at a department store and nights cleaning offices downtown. She never complained, but I could see it in her eyes, that constant calculation of whether the rent, the utilities, and the groceries could all fit inside the same paycheck. From her, I learned 2 things. First, you never let anyone tell you what you're worth. You decide that yourself. Second, you don't wait for rescue. If you want out of the mess you're in, you fight your way out. She didn't have much formal education, but she taught me strategy without even knowing it, like how to time your bill payments to keep the lights on just long enough for the next paycheck, or how to stretch $1 until it practically begged for mercy. By high school, I was working weekends at that same diner. The first time I held a tip in my hand, I knew I was addicted to the feeling of earning my own money. It wasn't just about survival, it was about control. That crumpled $5 bill was mine. No one could take it without my say-so. College wasn't handed to me either. I pieced together scholarships, took night classes, and worked every spare hour. When I finally got my business degree, I walked across that stage knowing I'd built every step myself. I wasn't the smartest in the room, but I was the hungriest. That hunger landed me my first job in real estate, starting at the bottom, in a dingy little office that smelled like old carpet and burnt toner. My boss thought Madison from Joliet would just file paperwork and fetch coffee. Within 6 months, I was closing deals he'd been chasing for years. I saw angles others missed because I'd been trained my whole life to find cracks in walls and slip through them. So when people assume my position at Whitman Properties came from marrying Jason, it's almost funny. They don't see the 4 a.m. mornings, the 12-hour workdays, or the years of watching every penny. They see the power suits and the skyline view, and they think the story started there. But here's the thing about coming from nothing. You don't forget the climb. You don't forget the smell of bleach on your mom's work clothes, or the way your stomach knots when the landlord's truck pulls up outside. That history isn't a weakness, it's armor. It's why I can walk into a boardroom full of men twice my age and not blink when they test me. It's also why Veronica's little plot was never going to work. She's the type who thinks money is just a shiny backdrop, something you pose in front of for Instagram. She's never fought to keep the lights on, or wondered if her card would be declined in a grocery line. She doesn't understand that real power isn't about what you're born into. It's about what you can hold on to when someone tries to rip it away. That's the difference between us. She believes in shortcuts. I believe in strategies. She sees Jason as a jackpot. I see him as a liability I've been quietly managing for years. And now that she's stepped into my world, she's going to find out that I don't just survive storms, I learn to steer them. If you've ever had people underestimate you because of where you came from, you know exactly how satisfying it is to prove them wrong. And I'd love to hear your story. What's the hardest climb you've made, and how did it change you? Drop it in the comments. Because for me, that climb from Joliet to Chicago's power corridors wasn't just about making it. It was training for exactly this kind of battle. And whether Veronica knew it or not, she'd just declared war on someone who'd been fighting uphill her entire life. Jason and I couldn't have been more different if we'd tried. I came into our marriage with a mental playbook, 5-year goals, strategies for building wealth plans for the family we might one day have. Jason was raised in a house where plans were optional because money cushioned every fall. I still remember the first time I visited the Whitman estate. It wasn't just big, it was the kind of sprawling property you see in glossy real estate magazines, complete with a marble-floored foyer and a chandelier the size of my first apartment. Jason had grown up walking past that chandelier every day, so he didn't see it as remarkable. He'd tell stories about skipping school to jet off to Aspen with friends, or how his dad surprised him with a brand new sports car for his 17th birthday. And here's the thing, Jason isn't a bad man. He's charming in that easy, slow smile way, and people gravitate toward him. But charm is a dangerous currency when it's all you've got. He never developed the grit that comes from failing and clawing your way back. Instead, when things got hard, he'd retreat into video games, into weekend getaways, into anything but the problem at hand. Early in our marriage, I thought maybe I could light that fire in him. I'd share ideas for investment opportunities, or try to pull him into conversations about the company. But he'd just wave a hand telling me, "You've got the brain for that stuff. I'll just get in the way." At first it sounded like humility. Later I realized it was surrender. When his father gave him an advisory position at Whitman Properties, I assumed it was a stepping stone that Jason would learn the ropes and eventually shoulder some responsibility. But weeks turned into months, and he barely showed up for board meetings. If he did, he'd sit back, offer a generic comment, and duck out early. It was as if the title was just another shiny toy he didn't feel like playing with anymore. Meanwhile, I was grinding. I knew every active project, every zoning dispute, every fluctuation in the market. I could walk into a meeting with half a dozen developers and tell you exactly which one would fold under pressure. My role wasn't ceremonial, it was earned, and I treated it like the livelihood of hundreds of employees depended on it, because it did. And yet, no matter how much I pulled my weight, Jason's apathy seeped into our home life. Dinner conversations dwindled into small talk, weather, traffic, whatever Netflix show he was half watching. We stopped making plans together. I'd come home late from a negotiation that could net the company millions, and he'd barely look up from his phone to ask how it went. I told myself we were just in a rough patch. People drift, they come back. But looking back now, I see that the drift was permanent. Jason didn't want a partner, he wanted a life raft. And the second someone else paddled by promising calmer waters, he was willing to jump ship. That's what made his affair with Veronica sting in such a specific way. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a confirmation of something I'd been refusing to admit. He had no interest in building anything with me, not a marriage, not a future, not even his own career. He wanted easy. Veronica offered him the illusion of it, and he grabbed on. But what neither of them understood is that easy comes with a price. They thought my connection to the Whitman name was my lifeline, when in reality I was the one keeping Jason tethered to the business at all. Without me, he was just a surname on a letterhead, a role anyone could fill. If you've ever realized someone in your life was just along for the ride, you know the cold clarity that follows. And I want you to think about this. Are you carrying someone who would drop you the moment another ride came along? It's a question worth asking, because the answer might change everything. For me, the answer was already forming. Jason had made his choice, and soon I'd make mine. And unlike him, I'd thought mine through to the very last move. Charles Whitman was a man who noticed everything, even if he didn't say it out loud. From the first dinner I attended at the Whitman estate, I could feel his eyes on me, not in a suspicious way, but in that calculating way you see in people who've built empires from nothing. He was the kind of man who tested you without warning, dropped little challenges in conversation to see if you'd rise to meet them. At that first dinner, he'd asked about a recent zoning dispute on one of our downtown projects. I wasn't even working for Whitman Properties yet, but I'd followed the case in the news. I laid out the key sticking points, the likely court outcome, and how I'd have negotiated it differently. He didn't smile, he didn't nod. He just studied me for a long second before changing the subject. 6 months later, just after Jason and I got married, Charles called me into his study. He sat behind that enormous mahogany desk, the kind that made you feel like you were standing in front of a judge. This company, he said, needs people who can see the cracks before the wall comes down. You've got that eye. Work with us. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a test. I said yes. And stepping into that office for the first time felt like walking onto a different planet. Real estate development wasn't just about buying and selling property. It was a game of chess played in millions of dollars and years-long timelines. There were contracts to negotiate, politicians to charm, and competitors to outmaneuver. I didn't know all the moves yet, but I knew how to read a board. Charles didn't coddle me. In meetings, he'd challenge my numbers, push me to defend every proposal, and call out when I was leaning too much on instinct instead of data. Some people might have folded under that pressure. For me, it was like oxygen. The board didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Most of them were older men who'd been with the company since before Jason was born. To them, I was the daughter-in-law, a guest at their table. But I knew how to play the long game. I didn't try to impress them with charm or flattery. I brought them solutions, ways to cut costs, without cutting quality negotiation strategies that saved millions on supplier contracts, proposals that actually delivered results. One by one, their skepticism turned into something else. They started asking for my take before making decisions. They began to see me not as Jason's wife, but as someone who could hold her own in a room full of power brokers. Meanwhile, Jason was a ghost in the building. He'd show up late to board meetings, or skip them entirely, always with some vague excuse. At first, I tried to cover for him, thinking it was just a phase. But the more I saw how little he cared, the more I realized Charles hadn't asked me to join the company for Jason's sake. He'd done it because he saw what I could bring to the table. The shift happened quietly. One day, Charles began looping me into confidential strategy sessions. Another day, he had me lead a meeting without warning. And then, just like that, I was the one people called when they needed answers fast. Looking back, that was when my position at Whitman Properties stopped being an extension of my marriage and became something entirely my own. My name might not have been on the letterhead, but my fingerprints were all over the company's biggest wins. That's what made Veronica's ambitions so laughable. She thought marrying Jason would put her at the helm. She didn't realize that the man she was chasing hadn't been steering anything for years. And maybe that's a reminder for anyone watching: don't assume you know who's really running the show. In business and in life, power isn't always where you think it is. Sometimes it's in the hands of the person quietly making things happen, while everyone else is distracted by the title on the door. By the time Veronica stepped into the picture, my place in the company wasn't just secure, it was vital. And she was about to find out that trying to edge me out wasn't just a bad idea. It was career suicide. If Veronica had been a storm, she would have been the kind that rolls in slow, just a thin, dark line on the horizon that you think you can ignore until the sky cracks open above you. She'd been part of my life in an off-and-on way since my mother married her father when I was 16. Back then, she was already 3 years older, already more polished, already an expert at sizing people up for what they could give her. Her father didn't last 3 years into the marriage, he was gone, leaving my mom and me back where we started. But Veronica, she floated on chasing shiny things with the same restless hunger she'd always had. Her first marriage had been to a high-profile defense attorney. It ended when she was caught cheating with one of his clients, a scandal that played out like a courtroom soap opera. She walked away with a pile of alimony payments and a reputation that in certain circles was more infamous than glamorous. But Veronica didn't care about whispers. She cared about staying relevant. And when the money started to thin and the invitations stopped coming, she began scanning the horizon for her next opportunity. That's where Jason came in. She met him properly for the first time at a family barbecue 2 summers ago. Jason was doing what Jason always did, standing in the shade with a drink in his hand, letting other people carry the conversation. I was busy fielding calls about a development proposal, so I didn't notice at first how Veronica kept gravitating toward him. Later, I'd remember how she laughed just a little too hard at his dry jokes, how she asked him questions that made him straighten up like someone had finally noticed him. Jason has a certain kind of appeal. He's not the loudest in the room, but he's disarming. That quiet, easy charm makes people feel like they're the most important person there. It's one of the few traits that makes him valuable in a negotiation, though he rarely applies it to business. Veronica picked up on it instantly. She also picked up on something else. The name Whitman still carried weight even if Jason did nothing to maintain it. To her, Whitman meant wealth status, and a lifetime pass into rooms she wanted to be in. She didn't know, or maybe didn't care, that Jason's position at the company was more ceremonial than powerful. She just saw the last name and assumed the rest. And Jason. He was the perfect mark. He'd been adrift for years, and Veronica offered something I no longer could: validation without expectation. She didn't push him to show up at meetings or question why he spent his afternoons golfing instead of working. She fed his ego, and in return he opened the door to her next move. At first I brushed it off. I was too busy handling multi-million-dollar contract negotiations and smoothing out disputes between investors. If I noticed her texts to him or her sudden appearances at events she'd never cared about before, I told myself it was harmless. Family right, but storms don't stay on the horizon forever. One evening I came home late from a tense meeting with city officials about zoning rights. Jason was waiting in the living room, no TV on, no phone in hand, just sitting there. His expression was heavy in a way I hadn't seen before. When he told me Veronica was pregnant and he wanted a divorce, I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything. I just sat there listening, my mind already cataloging what this meant, not for my marriage, but for my position, for my future. Because Veronica might have been chasing Jason, but make no mistake, her real target was me. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had someone circle into your life, pretending they were after one thing, but you knew they were really aiming at something else entirely. That's the thing about storms. They rarely hit the way you expect. And this one was about to find out that I don't get washed away. I rebuild stronger. Every time. If Veronica's first moves were subtle, what came next was a full-court press. She didn't just linger on the edges anymore, she planted herself firmly in Jason's orbit, and she did it with the kind of confidence that only comes from thinking you've already won. It started with those innocent catch-ups. She'd text Jason about grabbing coffee or needing help with something around her apartment. At first he mentioned them casually, like it was no big deal. She just wanted to talk about her divorce settlement, he'd say. Or, she needed me to look at her car. But here's the thing, Jason doesn't know the first thing about cars, and Veronica. She's perfectly capable of finding a mechanic. Those weren't errands, they were invitations. I'd come home from 12-hour days negotiating contracts and find him grinning over some text from her, that half smirk he used to give me when we were first dating. The shift was subtle, but I could feel it. His energy was different, lighter, more engaged, but not with me. Veronica knew exactly what she was doing. She played the long game in stilettos. She didn't push too hard, didn't come off as desperate. Instead, she positioned herself as the one person who understood him, who didn't nag him about work or pressure him to be more than he wanted to be. She let him stay small, and in return, he made her feel big, like she had a front-row seat to the Whitman name even if she didn't have the ticket yet. The problem was, I underestimated her persistence. I thought Jason's inertia would keep him from doing anything drastic. But Veronica. She thrives on the thrill of the chase, and once she decided Jason was her next big win, there was no slowing her down. Looking back, the warning signs were all there. The way she suddenly started showing up at Whitman Properties charity events, wearing dresses that hugged every curve, laughing too loudly at Jason's side while I worked the room. The way her social media posts became sprinkled with candid shots of them in group settings, her hand always just close enough to imply something more. Jason, for his part, didn't resist. Why would he? Veronica was a distraction from the parts of his life he didn't want to face: the marriage that required effort, the career that demanded ambition. She gave him an escape, and he took it without thinking about the cost. But I was thinking about the cost. I always am. And I knew if this escalated, it wouldn't just be my marriage on the line, it would be my standing in the company. Because perception is everything in our world, and a messy public implosion could give the board all the excuse they needed to push me out under the guise of avoiding conflict. So I watched. I gathered details not out of paranoia, but out of strategy. You can't counter a move you don't understand, and I needed to know exactly what game she thought she was playing. The night Jason finally confessed was almost anticlimactic. I walked in from work still in heels, my phone buzzing with follow-up calls from a high-stakes negotiation. He was sitting on the couch, the TV dark, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Veronica's pregnant," he said. "It's mine. I want a divorce." There it was. No let-up, no apology, just the verdict. For a split second, I felt the sting. Not because I wanted to fight for him, but because of the sheer audacity. My stepsister, who had failed upward her entire life, was now trying to cut me out of my own narrative. And Jason, he was letting her. But here's what neither of them understood: they'd just moved their queen into the open. And in chess, that's when you strike. If you've ever watched someone set up their own downfall, you know it's both infuriating and strangely satisfying. Drop me a comment if you've seen it happen, because this was the moment I knew exactly how I was going to play my next move. And I promise you, it wasn't going to end the way they thought. The morning after Jason's confession, the city looked exactly the same: taxis honking, steam curling up from manhole covers, the hum of early commuters. But my world had shifted on its axis. I went through my routine on autopilot, the way a soldier might keep cleaning a rifle even after the battle's been called. Suit on, hair pulled back, coffee in a to-go cup, phone charged. But every move I made was powered by a single, unshakable thought. I'm not just losing a husband, I'm walking into a battlefield. See, divorcing Jason wasn't like divorcing an ordinary man. In the Whitman orbit, marriage and business are woven together like steel cables. My position at the company, my influence on the board, my seat in negotiations, all of it could be undermined if people decided I was no longer family. And Veronica, she would waste no time in planting that idea. I couldn't afford to react emotionally. In real estate, the moment you start making decisions from a place of hurt instead of strategy, you've already lost. I'd seen it happen to competitors: men who let pride drive them into bad deals, women who let anger push them into scorched earth tactics that backfired. I wasn't going to be one of them. So instead of confronting Jason again, I started preparing my position. First step: secure my standing with the one person who could neutralize any attack: Charles Whitman. He wasn't just the patriarch. He was the gatekeeper of the empire. If he was on my side, no amount of gossip or maneuvering could push me out. I called his assistant and scheduled a meeting for the very next morning. No explanations, no hints. Just tell Charles, I need 15 minutes in person. When she confirmed, I felt the first flicker of control slide back into place. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept looping through every possible scenario Veronica might try. Would she paint me as cold and career-obsessed? Would she frame herself as the doting mother-to-be, ready to support Jason as he stepped into a leadership role he'd never wanted? Whatever angle she took, it would hinge on one lie: that Jason was the heir to the Whitman throne. And that lie, that was my greatest weapon. I knew the truth. Jason's role at Whitman Properties was a courtesy, a way for Charles to keep him connected to the family without putting the company at risk. The board respected the Whitman name, but they knew Jason wasn't the one steering the ship. I was. The next morning, I drove out to the estate. Lake Forest was quiet that early, the tree-lined streets damp with dew. Pulling through the wrought iron gates, I felt the same surge of determination I get before a big closing: the knowledge that everything hinges on what I say and how I say it. Charles was in his study, as always, a fortress of leather chairs, dark wood, and the faint scent of cigar smoke. He looked up from a stack of blueprints, eyes sharp. "Madison," he said, "what's wrong?" I didn't waste time. I told him everything: Jason's affair, Veronica's claim of pregnancy, the request for divorce. I laid it out like a quarterly report: facts first, emotion second. When I finished, the silence was thick enough to hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Charles leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You're the heart of this company," he said. "I don't care what Jason does. You keep running things. I'll handle him." Relief rushed through me, but it was tempered with a hard truth: Charles valued the company over his own son. It was cold, but it was also the confirmation I needed. My place was safe for now. Driving back to the city, I passed the glass towers I'd helped fill with tenants, the construction sites I'd fought to bring in under budget. I thought about how easy it would be for someone like Veronica to mistake those towers for trophies she could claim. But trophies don't build themselves. And if she thought she could step into my role just by marrying Jason, she was about to learn how wrong she was. If you've ever had to steady yourself before walking into a confrontation, you know that feeling, that steel in your spine. Tell me in the comments if you've been there. Because in that moment, I knew the divorce might be inevitable, but losing what I'd built, not an option. And I was just getting started. When you work in high-stakes real estate, you learn the art of the open loop, dangling just enough information to keep everyone leaning in, waiting for the rest. In boardrooms, it's a tactic. In life, it's a weapon. By the time I'd left Charles's study, I'd already decided that my next step wasn't to confront Veronica. It was to let her keep playing her hand, convinced she was in control. I wanted her comfortable, overconfident, thinking she'd already won. People make mistakes when they think victory is inevitable. Jason, on the other hand, didn't know what to make of my composure. He'd clearly expected shouting, maybe some dramatic packing of bags. Instead, I treated him like a tenant whose lease was about to expire, professional, detached, and already planning for the next occupant. That seemed to rattle him, though he tried to cover it with the same casual shrug that had driven me crazy for years. 2 days later, Veronica showed up at our penthouse unannounced. I was home between meetings, laptop open on the kitchen island, when she waltzed in like she owned the place. A silk dress clung to her frame, and she carried one of those handbags you only buy when you're either flush with cash or desperate for people to think you are. "I'm so sorry you couldn't have kids," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you get plenty of money to start over. Just leave this place." She gestured at the panoramic city view behind me like she was already taking mental ownership of it. Jason sat on the couch silent as a statue, eyes fixed on the floor. It took everything I had not to laugh. She thought this condo was Jason's asset. She thought he was the CEO, flush with personal wealth, ready to bankroll her designer lifestyle. She had no idea the unit was company-owned, leased to employees at market rate. She had no idea Jason's executive salary barely covered his car payment. So I played along. "Divorce is fine," I told her, my voice steady. "We'll need lawyers to sort out alimony and property." Then I leaned forward just slightly. "And Veronica, you really think Jason is the prize you're after?" Her eyes narrowed. "I know it's real, Madison. He's got everything I need." I wanted to tell her then and there how wrong she was, but instead, I let the moment hang open loop. Let her stew in her assumptions a little longer. Behind the scenes, my attorney Mia was already preparing for the divorce negotiations. Mia was a surgical strike wrapped in a tailored suit. She didn't posture, she dismantled. I'd seen her reduce arrogant developers to stammering messes, and I knew she'd treat Veronica the same way. When I explained the situation, Mia's mouth quirked into a half smile. "We'll handle this," she said, "but I want her blindsided." That was the plan. Keep Veronica dancing toward the cliff edge, thinking it was the red carpet. The night before the meeting, I barely slept, not out of anxiety, but out of anticipation. I kept replaying how it would go, every revelation timed, like a perfectly scripted deal close. And that's the part where I want you to lean in with me, because what happened in that conference room wasn't just a divorce negotiation. It was the moment the entire game flipped on its head. I walked into that room knowing exactly how the next 2 hours would unfold. Veronica walked in thinking she was about to collect her crown. Only one of us was right. The conference room at Whitman Properties wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows with a skyline view that made you feel small, a 12-foot mahogany table that swallowed anyone who sat at it, and chairs so stiff they forced perfect posture. I'd chosen it for a reason. Mia and I arrived early. She spread out our documents with the precision of a surgeon laying out scalpels. "Remember," she murmured, "we don't rush. Let her make the first move." Right on cue, Veronica swept in Jason, trailing behind her like an afterthought. She wore a fitted white blazer, pure virtuous, the whole future Mrs. Whitman act. Jason looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, his tie crooked, his expression unreadable. Veronica didn't bother with small talk. She dropped her designer bag onto the table and leaned back in her chair, one stiletto crossed over the other. "Let's not drag this out," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rachel, sorry, Madison, name your price for alimony. I'll make sure you're taken care of." The way she said it like she was doing me a favor almost made me laugh, but I kept my expression neutral and let Mia handle it. "Since you're offering," Mia said smoothly, sliding a crisp legal document across the table, "we'll be claiming alimony from both Jason and you, Veronica." Veronica blinked, the confidence in her eyes flickering for the first time. "Me, I'm already paying my ex." "That's not our concern," Mia interrupted, her voice a scalpel cutting clean. I leaned back, watching the crack in her armor widen. This was exactly how you dismantle someone who's convinced they're untouchable, methodically, piece by piece. Next came the property division. Veronica leaned forward, grasping for control. "This condo's Jason's family's right. It's not part of the split." Mia didn't miss a beat. "The condo and the land it's on belong to Whitman Properties. The company decides who stays." Jason frowned, glancing at me. "Wait, I thought it was Dad's." Veronica's head snapped toward him. "So, we can't live here." "You can if the company allows it," Mia replied. "But that's up to the acting CEO." She turned to me, and I saw the moment Veronica's eyes widened as the truth clicked into place. "Hold on," she said, her voice sharp. "You're not the CEO, Jason." I finally leaned forward, letting my voice cut through the tension. "No, Veronica. I'm the acting CEO. Jason is an advisor. No executive power. My father-in-law made me president when he retired. The board trusts me to run things." Jason shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Veronica stared at him, betrayal etched across her face, not because of what he'd done to me, but because he'd lied to her about what she thought she was getting. Mia wasn't done. She slid another document across the table, a rental agreement. "If you choose to stay in the condo, here's the market rate lease. Monthly rent is due on the 1st. Veronica's eyes scanned the number and her face went pale. Jason muttered under his breath, "My salary can't cover that." I sat back, letting the silence work its magic. The room felt heavy with the weight of her realization. The mansion and the sky life she'd envisioned wasn't hers for the taking. And that's the moment I want you to remember, because power isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about setting the stage so your opponent beats themselves. Veronica had walked in thinking she was holding all the cards. By the time she walked out, she knew she'd been playing the wrong game entirely. And the best part, the game wasn't even over yet. The thing about moments like that, when the truth finally lands, is that you can actually see the air shift. Veronica sat there, frozen, her manicured fingers tightening around the pen she'd brought, like it might somehow change the words on that lease. Jason avoided eye contact with both of us, staring out at the skyline, like maybe he could will himself into one of those other glass towers and start over somewhere else. Mia gave them a few beats to stew before she moved to the next item on the agenda. Now, regarding financial disclosures, she began sliding another folder across the table toward Jason. "You'll see a complete breakdown of shared accounts, outstanding liabilities, and a proposed split." Veronica leaned in, scanning the numbers, her confidence evaporating with every page. "Where's the rest?" she asked sharply. "This can't be everything." "It is," Mia said evenly. "Jason's personal accounts are separate and limited. The majority of household expenses have been covered from Madison's salary and bonuses, as you'll see on page 4. Her eyes darted to Jason, her voice rising a notch. "You told me." She stopped herself, glancing at me like she just remembered I was in the room. But I knew exactly what she was about to say. "You told me you had money." Jason shifted in his seat, still refusing to meet her gaze. "I didn't say," he started, then trailed off. That was Jason in a nutshell, never fully lying, but never telling the truth if it made him look small. Mia kept her tone professional, but the gleam in her eyes told me she was savoring every second. In short, she continued, "There are no hidden assets, no offshore accounts, no stockpile of funds for you to tap into. This settlement will be straightforward. No windfalls." I let the silence stretch. Veronica was processing not just the financial reality, but the humiliation of having her fantasy publicly dismantled. She'd built an entire future in her head, a future where she waltzed into Whitman Properties like some modern-day duchess, and now it was crumbling right there in black and white. Finally, she sat back, crossing her arms. "Fine. Then Jason and I will make our own way. We don't need your charity." Mia smiled politely. "Of course. But just to be clear, market rate rent on the condo is due whether you stay 1 month or 12, and any outstanding debts will be part of the final settlement. Jason rubbed the back of his neck, muttering, "We'll figure it out." But even he sounded like he didn't believe it. That was my cue. I gathered my papers, slid them neatly into my briefcase, and stood. Then we're done here for today. I looked at Veronica, meeting her gaze head-on. I hope you enjoy the view while it lasts. As Mia and I walked toward the elevator, I felt that rare, satisfying kind of calm that comes after a battle. You know you've won, not because you shouted the loudest, but because you came in prepared, every move calculated. On the ride down, Mia glanced at me. "You realize she's not going to last 3 months here, right?" I smiled. "Two tops. Once she sees what his actual paycheck looks like, she'll be gone. And here's the part I want you to take away. Sometimes the most effective revenge is simply letting reality do its job. No screaming, no drama, no elaborate schemes. Just the truth laid out in the cold light of day until the other person can't stand to look at it anymore." The truth was now in their hands, and I was more than happy to let it burn through whatever illusion they had left. The days after that meeting felt eerily quiet, like the city was holding its breath just to see what Veronica would do next. I didn't need to wait long. 2 mornings later, Mia called me before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. "She's already asked for the lease paperwork again," Mia said. "Apparently she wants to double-check the numbers." Translation: Veronica had spent 48 hours trying to make the math work, and it still didn't add up. The market rate rent for the penthouse was more than half of Jason's annual salary, and that was before utilities, car payments, or her lingering alimony to her ex-husband. Even if she drained whatever was left of her savings, it was a countdown to eviction. And that was exactly how I'd designed it. You see, people like Veronica thrive in fantasy. They build their confidence on the assumption that the ground beneath them is solid. The moment they realize it's sand, that confidence turns to panic. She had chased this condo like it was the crown jewel, not realizing it was company property, one board decision away from slipping through her fingers. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd started floating the idea of Jason taking a bigger role at Whitman Properties to boost his income. That rumor made its way back to Charles, and from what I was told, his response was as blunt as it was final: Jason's role stays as is. With that door slammed shut, the tension between her and Jason began to leak out in public. A friend of mine spotted them at a downtown restaurant. Voices raised Veronica, stabbing her fork into her salad like it had personally offended her. Jason just sat there, shoulders slumped, like he'd already run out of excuses. Then came the inevitable phone call. Not from Jason, but from Veronica herself. She tried to mask it as casual, just touching base, but her voice carried that brittle edge people get when they're one step from begging. She asked if the board might consider lowering the rent given the circumstances. I let the pause hang before answering. "The lease terms are standard for all employees, Veronica. You can always seek a more affordable unit if this one isn't a fit." She didn't thank me. She just muttered something under her breath and hung up. Within a week, she was making inquiries about short-term rentals in the suburbs. By the end of the month, a moving truck was idling outside the building boxes stacked haphazardly in the lobby. Jason stood by, looking lost, his tie askew, while Veronica barked orders at the movers. It was almost anticlimactic. After all the scheming, all the smug posturing, she was retreating without a real fight. But that's the thing about people who plot for the spotlight. When it turns harsh and unflattering, they can't wait to step out of it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The beauty of the situation was that I hadn't lifted a finger beyond telling the truth and letting the systems already in place do their work. The lease was just business policy. Jason's stagnant role was his own choice. Veronica's downfall was simply the collision of those realities. And maybe that's the quietest kind of victory, the kind where you walk away without breaking a sweat, knowing the other person will spend years trying to rewrite the ending. By the time the movers pulled away, the penthouse was mine again, in every way that mattered. Not because I'd fought tooth and nail for it, but because I'd never let anyone convince me it wasn't already. What Veronica learned the hard way is something I've built my entire life on. If you didn't earn it, you can't keep it. And I was far from done proving that point. It didn't take long for the next crack in Veronica's story to appear, and this one was big enough to swallow her whole. About 3 weeks after she moved out of the penthouse, I got a call from Charles's assistant. "You might want to hear this directly," she said, her voice low, but laced with satisfaction. The pregnancy, it was a lie. I didn't even blink. I'd suspected from the start that Veronica's announcement was more strategic than biological. She'd dangled it like a golden ticket, betting that a Whitman grandchild would buy her permanent access to the family and the company. But here's the thing about lies, they don't just collapse, they detonate. Apparently, she'd confided to a friend that the pregnancy was a ploy, and that friend, either out of loyalty to me or simple opportunism, had passed it along to someone in the Whitman circle. It didn't take long for it to reach Charles. From what I heard, the confrontation at the estate was brutal. Charles, who had been icy but polite toward her before, didn't bother hiding his disgust this time. "You're nothing to this family," he told her, each word deliberate like a judge handing down a sentence. My mother-in-law, who had been over the moon about the prospect of a grandchild, was crushed. The sympathy she'd shown Veronica evaporated on the spot. The news spread through the upper ranks of Whitman Properties faster than a hot listing. Board members who had tolerated Veronica's presence suddenly had no reason to entertain her. Her name became shorthand for cautionary tale in hushed hallway conversations. And Jason, he didn't defend her. In fact, I heard from one of his cousins that he looked more embarrassed than angry, muttering that he didn't know what to believe anymore. But if I'm being honest, I think he knew exactly what to believe, he just didn't like the reflection it cast back on him. Veronica predictably tried to recover. She floated rumors that she had miscarried and that the stress of the divorce had been to blame. But by then, no one cared enough to dissect her timeline. Her credibility was gone, and without it, so was her social standing. Within days, she stopped showing up at any event where Whitman Properties executives might be present. Friends in the city spotted her at smaller bars on the outskirts, usually alone, sometimes with a man who clearly had no idea who she used to pretend to be. It would have been easy to feel triumphant to see her unravel and call it justice. But for me, it was more than that. It was proof that integrity isn't just a buzzword people throw around in corporate retreats. It's a currency. And once you spend it recklessly, there's no getting it back. What struck me most was how quiet my own life felt in comparison. No frantic damage control, no scrambling to fix a story. My days were spent doing what I'd always done, closing deals, leading projects, mentoring junior executives. Stability isn't flashy, but it's powerful. And in a world where people like Veronica chase quick wins, it's also rare. And that's something I think everyone should hear sometimes. The best way to win is to outlast. You don't have to push your rival off the cliff if they're already sprinting toward the edge. By the time the dust settled, Veronica had vanished from the city's social scene entirely. The woman who had once walked into my home like she owned it was now little more than a whisper in rooms she'd never be invited into again. For me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure, the kind you don't have to announce because it's written all over the way you carry yourself when the storm has passed. And I carried it into every meeting, every decision, knowing I'd protected not just my position but my name. It was almost poetic, the way Veronica's exit from my life came without ceremony, no screaming matches, no last-minute appeals, just absence. But in the quiet that followed, another familiar figure began to reappear: Jason. It started with small things. A text out of the blue, "Hope you're doing okay." An email forwarding me an article about a development project, as if we were still colleagues swapping industry news. Then one Friday evening, I came home from a long day at the office to find him waiting outside my new apartment in Midtown. I'd chosen this place for its clean lines and open space. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, and everything from the minimalist furniture to the absence of clutter felt deliberate. It was mine, untouched by the Whitman name or anyone else's expectations. Jason stood there in a pressed shirt that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in his face. He held a coffee cup like it was some kind of peace offering. "Madison," he began, his voice softer than I remembered. "Maybe we could try again?" I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. "Try again, Jason. You cheated on me with my stepsister. You let her waltz into our life and nearly dismantle everything I built. You didn't just check out of our marriage, you vacated the premises a long time ago." He flinched, but I didn't stop. "You made your choices, and I've made mine." What I didn't say, but both of us knew, was that his circumstances had changed. Charles had stripped him of any ceremonial influence in the company, reassigning him to a back-office role that barely kept him in the building. His salary had been slashed, and without Veronica's illusions to prop him up, he was facing the reality of standing on his own for the first time in his life. He muttered something about things being different now, but the truth was, They weren't. Not really. He was still the same man who chose comfort over challenge, who would rather coast than climb. The only difference was that his safety net had been cut away. I told him plainly I'm not interested in rewriting the past. And I'm certainly not interested in repeating it. For a moment, I saw something flash in his eyes, regret maybe. Or the dawning realization that this door wasn't just closing, it was locking. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, the click of his shoes fading down the hallway. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a slow breath. There was no surge of victory, no cinematic rush of empowerment, just relief. Relief that I no longer felt the need to save someone who had never tried to save himself. In the weeks that followed, the absence of Jason and the chaos he'd brought with him felt like clearing storm clouds from the skyline. My focus returned entirely to Whitman Properties. I threw myself into projects that mattered, ones that would shape the city for decades. The board meetings that once carried an undercurrent of politics now felt like pure strategy sessions, free of the personal landmines I'd been tiptoeing around. And yet there was a part of me that couldn't help but see Jason's return attempt as the final confirmation of something I'd suspected all along: when people show you who they are, believe them. If you've ever had someone come back after burning the bridge, you know how tempting it can be to look over your shoulder. But here's the truth: you built that bridge for a reason, and if it's ashes now, it's because leaving it behind was the safest choice you could make. Jason had walked away from me long before I walked away from him. And now, finally, I was walking towards something else entirely, my life on my terms. The first Monday after Jason's failed reunion attempt, I arrived at Whitman Properties earlier than anyone else. The sunrise spilled through the glass walls of my corner office, painting the desk in soft gold. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was no knot in my stomach, no sense of impending confrontation. The company was mine now, not by ownership on paper, but in spirit, in influence, in the way the board deferred to my judgment without hesitation. Charles had made it official at the last quarterly meeting. Madison is the reason we're thriving. She's the one who will carry this company forward. And carry it forward I did. Within weeks, I had approved a groundbreaking urban renewal project, something no one else had the vision or courage to greenlight. The press ate it up. Headlines called me the Iron Visionary of Manhattan real estate. Social media turned my name into a case study for leadership under fire. Investors who'd once side-eyed me because of my marriage to Jason now treated me like the cornerstone of their portfolios. It was strange, though. With success came an unexpected quiet. There was no one waiting at home to unload the day's victories, on no partner to toast the wins or soften the hard edges of the losses. But instead of loneliness, I felt a kind of peace, like I'd finally stepped out of a constant storm. One Thursday evening, I stayed late to review the final renderings for a luxury high-rise. The city was glowing beyond the window, each light in the skyline a reminder of the life I'd built here. That's when I thought of the people who'd doubted me, Jason, Veronica, even some on the board in the early days. They had all assumed I was standing on borrowed ground. But the truth was, I'd been pouring the foundation myself all along. When the project officially broke ground, Charles called me into his office. He was standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city. "You know," he said, "your mother-in-law used to tell me you'd never last in this business." Too idealistic, she thought. Too soft. I smiled faintly. Guess I proved her wrong. "No," he said, turning to face me. "You proved everyone wrong, including me at times. Madison, I've never been prouder." It hit me then. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about proving I could hold my ground after betrayal. It was about claiming the life, the career, the influence I had always been capable of, without apology and without compromise. That night, walking home through the hum of the city, I made a quiet promise to myself: I would never again let someone else's presence define my worth. My identity wasn't Jason's wife, or Veronica's rival, or even Charles's protege. I was Madison Cole, leader, builder, survivor. And here's where I'll lean in for a second, because if you've made it this far into my story, you probably understand the pull of watching someone fight their way out of a corner. If you've ever wanted to see what happens when someone refuses to be defined by their betrayals, you might want to stick around for the next story I share, because trust me, this one's just the beginning. As I turned onto my street, the wind picked up, carrying the distant hum of construction somewhere in the city. It sounded like progress. It sounded like possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding. After the wreckage, I was building something entirely new, something entirely mine. The seasons shifted, and with them, so did my life. The bitter winds of betrayal that once howled through every corner of my mind were now a distant echo replaced by the warm hum of possibility. My apartment, once a quiet refuge from chaos, had transformed into a space filled with laughter, from friends' late-night strategy sessions with my team, and moments of stillness that I'd come to treasure. On Saturday mornings, I'd take long walks through Central Park, coffee in hand, watching joggers weave past and children chase each other through the grass. These walks became a ritual, a reminder that even in a city that never stops moving, you can find your own rhythm. I started picking up hobbies I'd forgotten. I loved photography, painting, even cooking elaborate meals for one. It wasn't about filling the silence anymore, it was about enjoying it. I realized that for so many years, I'd been living in response to others, reacting to their choices, defending against their betrayals, chasing their approval. Now I was simply living. One evening, I received an email from a young woman I'd mentored early in my career. She wrote, "You taught me that I didn't have to ask for permission to take up space, that I could fight for what I wanted and still be kind. I'm running my own firm now, and I owe that to you." I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it, a quiet smile settling on my face. This was it, the legacy I wanted to leave. Not just the buildings I helped construct, but the lives I influenced, the people I inspired to hold their ground when the world tried to push them aside. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I think back to that night in the penthouse when my world cracked open. I thought it was the end, but in truth it was the beginning of everything. If there's one lesson my story leaves behind, it's this. You are never as powerless as someone wants you to believe. Even in your lowest moments, you hold the pen. You decide the next chapter. And so I keep writing mine, one bold choice, one quiet joy, one unapologetic step at a time.